So as I said when I introduced the Torah reading this morning, it includes many, many laws. 10% of the 613 laws of the Torah are found in Parashat Mishpatim that regulate human behavior for the most part. The laws are sort of a mishmash, but for the most part, they're laws regulating human interactions, like do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness. Within these direct commandments, right, which clearly set the boundaries of human interaction, you find an interesting prohibition that we read this morning that not only delineates a boundary, but also warns that God will instantly respond if you break that boundary. This is what we read. Kol almana v'yatom lo te'onun. Do not abuse the widow or the orphan. You think it would end there, right? Many of the laws just end with the direct commandment. But this subject continues. Im ane te'ane oto. If you abuse them. Ki im tza'ok yitz'ak elai. And they cry out unto me, Shamoa eshma tza'akato. I will hear their cry. God is responding. V'chara api. My anger will be aroused. V'haragti etchem becherbi. I will kill you with the sword. V'hayu neshechem almanot. Your wives will become widows. U'v'nechem yetomim. And your children will become orphans. In other words, you abuse the widows and the orphans, I will turn you into widows and orphans. These are some very, very powerful and consequential verses in the Torah. Not only because, as I said, they carry with them the certainty of God's response, but did you notice the doubling of language? Im ane te'ane, tza'ok yitz'ak, shamoa eshma. When language is doubled in Hebrew, there's no exclamation mark in biblical Hebrew. This is an exclamation mark. The verb is doubled. Shamoa eshma. I will certainly hear. The prohibition against abusing a widow or an orphan is very, very serious. But why? Shouldn't it be forbidden to abuse anybody? Why do we specifically mention the plight of the widow and the orphan? But the Torah sees the widow and the orphan as emblematic of those who are the most vulnerable in our community, those whose physical and emotional existence are most precarious. Anyone, particularly those entrusted to lead the community, but anyone who adds to the misery of these poor souls will have to reckon with an angry God, not only for mistreatment, but also for not having empathy. The most vulnerable, remember, are the ones that the Amalekites attacked. They were the easy prey. The master villains in the Torah did just that. What kind of person would add to the suffering of somebody who's already suffering? What kind of man would press his advantage against someone who has no recourse? Only someone who deserves no standing, only an Amalekite. The Torah speaks of the widow and the orphan because they've always been taken advantage of by the mean and the powerful. In our day, we've become a lot better at taking care of the needs of the widow or the needs of the orphan. But it does not mean that we don't have vulnerable people in our community and in our society who continue to get taken advantage of. If you'll be watching the Olympics, which begin, I think, on Fridays, the opening ceremonies, take a look at all the countries that are represented and think of how many of them regularly take advantage of vulnerable people for the sake of some national interest, including, by the way, the host country. But that's a sermon on its own. Irv is speaking next week. Maybe he wants to speak about that. Today I would rather speak about vulnerable people in our community who get taken advantage of. Vulnerable people in our community who get taken advantage of and that we have some control over, some ability perhaps to protect, even to stop the abuse from happening. That is a topic of sexual abuse in the Jewish community, committed against victims that are in some ways even more vulnerable than widows and orphans. It gives me absolutely no pleasure, I must tell you, to have to speak about this topic, and I'd much rather speak about something more positive and hopeful. But these past few months have been a time of terrible shame for the Jewish community, a time that has revealed the seriousness of this plague and its pervasiveness within our own institutions. It's disgusting. There has not been any Jewish denomination shielded from it. It involves our synagogues, our schools, and our institutions. A recent investigation of activities in the Reform Movements Seminary, what's called the Hebrew Union College, detailed credible allegations of sexual harassment and other forms of sexual misconduct going back decades, involving dozens of students, stories of terrible exploitation involving very prominent Reform rabbis in prominent congregations. Our own conservative youth movement, USY, is defending itself right now against several lawsuits regarding the actions of a youth group leader who is alleged to have abused many, many teens, perhaps hundreds, while at the same time being protected by more senior leaders in the organization. The Orthodox world has been rocked by the story of a rabbi named Chaim Walder, a charismatic children's author who abused many victims for years and was allowed to continue meeting with people when his activities were already well known. He recently committed suicide just a few days before one of his victims did the same. We've known about abuse in Hollywood, in the Catholic Church, in politics, in so many institutions of power. But as the late comedian Sam Levinson once said, Jews are just like everybody else except more so. We have the same human tendencies, the same weaknesses, the same evil inclinations that lead to abuse. They manifest in the Jewish world as much as everywhere else. Aneh te'aneh. If you abuse, tza'ok yitz'ak. The victim will cry out, shamoa eshma. I will surely listen. In other words, the Torah doesn't leave any doubt about which side Hashem is on. But while Hashem might be on the victim's side, the real question is, are we? The terrible stories of this year, and especially in the past few months, allow us to look at the horror endured by these most vulnerable people in our time, victims of sexual abuse. They are shamed physically, psychologically, and spiritually. And we have done too much to deny their trauma, to ignore their trauma, which just makes everything infinitely worse. Over the past few weeks, I've been giving some thought to the question of what we can do to better respond. How can we do a better job of shamoa eshma ourselves, surely listening, so that our institutions are better able to protect and better able to respond? Here are some suggestions. I'm not an expert, but here are 4 points that I've been thinking about that I think we ought to consider if we're going to take this issue of abuse seriously as a community. The first point to address is the importance of being able to talk openly about sexuality. For my grandparents' generation, that was something you just did not do. And actually, there's still many families today who don't have those conversations with each other. Sexuality is an uncomfortable subject, but avoiding these conversations and deeming them inappropriate, we have found, can be very, very dangerous. We live in a different world today, and we can't pretend it's 1940. Not just because there is more abuse out there, but because kids are exposed to sex at a much younger age. The more we treat sexuality like an improper topic, taboo, the less likely it is that our kids will know they are being abused. The less likely it is that our children will tell us when, God forbid, they see or experience abuse. It is not a conversation that you wait to have when your kids hit puberty. Most experts suggest you start having these conversations with your kids when they are between 5 and 8 years old. Talk specifically about appropriate and inappropriate behavior, appropriate and inappropriate touching. Allow your kids to ask questions. The more open, the better. That word taboo, get it out of the dictionary when it comes to this topic. The second important point to understand is that sexual abuse is first and foremost a criminal matter and not a religious one. Cases against abusers do not belong in religious courts, period. They need to be reported to police and investigated by police. I know this is a much more relevant issue in some parts of the community more than others. But what's interesting is that across the cases, the ones I mentioned before and many others, there is a common troubling trend of institutions and social groups preferring to deal with these matters internally rather than exposing them publicly, which will happen naturally if you turn to police. The first reaction is too often, let's see if we can handle this quietly. Institutions cannot deal with these cases internally. The evidence, you read the stories, speaks for itself. There are always so many conflicts of interests, far too many. Sexual abuse is a criminal matter first. There is no excuse for not referring such matters to police and law enforcement from the start. Number 3, we have to acknowledge that part of the story of this abuse comes from a distorted view of what women are and what men are. People think that when Beth Tikvah became egalitarian, it was about counting people in a minyan. But that is not true. The origin of the minyan problem comes from a Mishnah that places women in the same category as slaves and children. And it was that premise that we confronted and refuted when we became egalitarian. We said women today are primary actors, not secondary actors in Jewish religious life. They are not just there, like perhaps children or slaves are, to serve the needs of the primary male actor. I'm not saying that Jews who pray in non-egalitarian settings are fostering a culture of abuse, but I do think they have to work much harder to confront the sense of power and superiority that sometimes leads men to think that they are able to take advantage of women and children, and that there's nothing wrong with that because that's what the Mishnah allows. And finally, I want to say something about Lashon Hara, or evil speech. I've given many sermons before about Lashon Hara. It is indeed a very serious sin in Judaism. Derogatory speech is prohibited, and you know that it's prohibited whether the information being conveyed is true or false. But unfortunately, the prohibition against Lashon Hara has been manipulated and taken to an extreme, somewhere it never should have been taken to, in order to protect abusers. One of Walder's victims said, "He made sure we knew that no transgression was worse than Lashon Hara." So let me quote you from the writings of a great Lithuanian rabbi who lived about 100 years ago, named Israel Isserlin, Zichrono Livracha. He writes this in his book on Lashon Hara. All the Musar books condemn the world for the sin of Lashon Hara. Musar means ethical, moral works. Musar. All the ethical Musar books condemn the world for the sin of Lashon Hara. But I condemn the world for the opposite, an even greater sin, which is more common, and that is withholding oneself from speaking up when it is necessary to save the oppressed from their oppressors. So let's be clear. When you're speaking about somebody else in order to protect others, that is not Lashon Hara. It's not just my opinion. That is the opinion of many rabbis who have explored and ruled on this subject, rabbis far greater than me. If you know something and you don't tell anyone, that is worse than Lashon Hara. You are obligated to speak up if you have information that can help. So these are just 4 points to consider among many others. And I want to close with one story about the same verses that I opened up with, just to impress upon all of us the importance that Judaism places on protecting the most vulnerable. The verse says, Im aneh te'aneh. As I mentioned, the doubling of the verb is curious. Why the emphasis? Aneh te'aneh, if you abuse. In the Midrash, one sage opines that the repetition, aneh te'aneh, is there to teach that one is guilty of abuse, whether a grievous affliction or a trivial one. Grievous or trivial. And what is a trivial case of abuse that could provoke God's anger? On Yom Kippur, we read the story of the martyrology, the 10 martyrs who were taken to death for practicing their Judaism. You know that service? I think we've cut it out from the past couple of years. But open up your machzor if you forget. You will read the stories of Rabbi Shimon bar Gamliel and Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol. They were both sentenced to death by the sword just for practicing their Judaism. When they were sentenced to death, they were put in a cell together, and Rabbi Yishmael was weeping. Rabban Shimon said to him, "Why are you crying? In just a few minutes, you will be sitting with me among the greatest tzaddikim that there have ever been, the greatest of the righteous in the world to come. But Rabbi Yishmael replied, I'm not sad over that. I'm sad over the way we are being led to death by the sword, like criminals who desecrated the Shabbat, like idol worshippers who worshipped idols. Rabbi Yishmael was asking why he was deserving of such a cruel form of punishment. In Jewish law, death by the sword is the cruelest form of death penalty that someone could receive. Rabban Shimon observed that while it was true that Rabbi Yishmael never desecrated Shabbat or never worshipped idols, he said this to him, perhaps once while you were eating or sleeping, a woman came to your door to ask you a question, and you caused her to wait until you had finished eating or sleeping. And the Torah prohibits this, as it says, you shall not torment a widow, for if you do, I will kill you by the sword. Think for a second about this story. One of the greatest rabbis of all time, Rabbi Yishmael, seeks to understand why he deserves such a cruel fate. Did I break Shabbos? Did I worship an idol? But the Talmud says no. You made a widow wait unnecessarily long. Maybe that is trivial in our eyes, but not in God's eyes. And if that's what we learn in the Midrash, imagine the implications for us. What about in all of these stories, those who didn't just keep the abused waiting, but never let them through the door at all? What about those who refused to hear them out, who refused to acknowledge them, refused to validate them, and put the onus and the hurt on them? It happened. All of that happened. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over again over years. That is what happened. I would love to pretend otherwise, but it happened. And we should not just carry on with our lives without confronting these terrible mistakes, but most importantly, without pledging openly to do better in the future. I hope you will join me in taking that pledge, in taking this issue seriously. Let's make sure that if God is on the side of the vulnerable, then so also are we. Shabbat Shalom.